They threw the sign at her feet before she even stepped off the wagon. It landed in the mud with a slap. A piece of wood, roughly painted, the letters crooked and mean, "Nobody's Bride." The crowd gathered outside Blackwater Ridge's general store erupted into laughter. Not the embarrassed kind. The kind that comes from people who have laughed at the same things their whole lives and never once wondered if they should stop. Clara Whitmore looked at the sign. Then she looked at the men who threw it. Ranch hands, mostly. Two of them still grinning with their arms crossed, waiting to see what she would do. She did not cry. She did not climb back onto the wagon. She picked up her suitcase with both hands and walked forward like the sign wasn't there, like the mud wasn't soaking through the hem of her dress, like 30 pairs of eyes weren't measuring every step she took and finding her wanting. That was the moment everything in her life split into before and after. If you've ever walked into a room where everyone expected you to fail, where the laughter was already waiting before you opened your mouth, then you already know what Clara Whitmore felt on that road in Blackwater Ridge. If that's ever been you, stay with this story, because what happens next is not what any of them expected. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that speaks to you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that muddy road and to the woman nobody wanted. Clara Whitmore was 26 years old, which was not young by the standards of a woman seeking a husband in 1883, and she knew it. She had been told so plainly and often enough that the knowledge had stopped stinging somewhere around her 23rd birthday and had settled instead into a kind of hard, quiet fact she carried. The way some people carry old injuries, not forgotten, just moved around. She had come from a small town in Ohio called Mill Haven, where her father ran a dry goods store, and her mother had died of fever when Clara was 11. She had grown up useful rather than pretty, though she was not without her looks. She had dark eyes and a steady, direct way of meeting your gaze that some men found unsettling and others found fascinating, and she had learned early that the ones who found it unsettling were not worth her time. She could read faster than anyone in Millhaven, calculate figures in her head that took other people paper and pencil, and she had spent years helping her father manage his accounts, his correspondence, and the quiet arguments with suppliers who assumed they could shortchange a man whose daughter wasn't paying attention. She had paid attention to everything. The mail order arrangement had been her idea, not her father's. He had been against it, not cruelly, but with the particular grief of a man who wanted something better for his daughter and was not sure this was it. "Clara," he had said, the evening she showed him the advertisement from the Frontier Placement Agency, "you don't have to do this. There are men here who would be glad to have you." "Name one," she said. He hadn't been able to, which was not his failure, and not entirely hers either, but simply the truth of Millhaven, a town too small to hold the kind of life she wanted, and too comfortable with its smallness to apologize for it. The agency had matched her with 3 ranchers in 6 months. The first had written back after seeing the photograph she submitted. A careful, honest photograph, not flattering, and simply not responded again. The second had met her off a train in Kansas City, looked her over for 45 seconds while she stood on the platform with her suitcase, and told her with genuine regret that she didn't look like she could handle the work. The third had been worse. He had taken her to dinner, smiled across the table, asked polite questions about her education, and then, 3 days later, sent a letter to the agency explaining that he needed a woman with more physical constitution for the demands of frontier life. She had read that letter twice, folded it, and placed it in the small tin box under her bed, where she kept things she needed to remember. Not because it hurt. It did hurt, but that wasn't why. She kept it because it reminded her of exactly what she was working against, and she had always done better when she could see the obstacle clearly. When the agency wrote with a 4th placement, they had been unusually blunt in their correspondence. The rancher in question is known to be difficult. He has returned 2 previous matches without giving reason. He runs a large cattle operation outside Blackwater Ridge, Montana Territory, and is considered one of the most successful landowners in the region. He is also considered, by most accounts, to be the loneliest man in it. We share this not to discourage you, Miss Whitmore, but because we believe you are a woman who prefers the truth. She had written back the same day, "Send the contract." What the agency had not told her, what nobody had told her, perhaps because they assumed it was obvious, was that Blackwater Ridge had opinions about Ethan Callahan's mail-order brides, the way small frontier towns have opinions about everything, loudly, collectively, and without much concern for the feelings of the people involved. By the time Clara's wagon rolled down the main street, the town had already decided the outcome. She could see it in the way people stopped what they were doing and turned to look. Not curious. Certain. They had the expressions of people watching a predictable thing happen. The sign had come from a man named Doyle Garrett, who was the first person she would come to understand as an enemy, though she didn't know his name yet, only his face. He was a wide, loud man in his 40s with a red neck and a grin that looked like it had been pasted on, and he was standing with a group of ranch hands outside the general store when the wagon passed. He was the one who picked up the rough-painted wood from the ground. He had prepared it, she realized later, which meant he had known she was coming and had taken the time, and threw it into the mud in front of the wagon horses. The horses didn't startle. The driver, an old man named Hector, who had been paid $2 to carry her from the stage depot, didn't say anything. He just pulled back slightly on the reins and waited, the way a man waits when he's seen this kind of thing before and has decided it's not his business. Clara stepped down from the wagon. She picked up her suitcase. She looked at the sign in the mud for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to read it, short enough not to give them the satisfaction of watching her read it. And she walked. Doyle Garrett said something to the men beside him, loud enough to carry. 12 days, he said. I give her 12 days before Callahan puts her on the next stage east. Laughter. She kept walking. A woman standing in the doorway of a dress shop watched her pass with an expression that wasn't cruel exactly, but wasn't kind either. It was the expression of someone calculating odds. Clara met her eyes as she passed, and the woman looked away first, which was something small, but felt like something. The agency had given her an address, Callahan's land office in town, where she was supposed to present herself and wait. The office was at the end of the main street, a narrow building wedged between a feed supplier and a barber shop, with a painted sign above the door that said simply, Callahan Holdings. The door was unlocked. Inside, a young clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up from a ledger, registered her presence, registered her suitcase, and arrived at an expression of careful neutrality that told her he'd been instructed to be polite regardless of what he thought. Miss Whitmore? He said. Yes. Mr. Callahan is out on the North Range. He'll be in before sundown. He gestured to a wooden chair against the wall. You can wait here. She sat. She set her suitcase beside her feet. Through the window, she could see the main street, and she watched Blackwater Ridge go about its afternoon business. Men on horseback, women in groups of 2 or 3, a dog sleeping in the dust outside the saloon. A town that had made up its mind about her in the first 30 seconds. She had 3 hours to wait, and she spent them the way she always spent difficult hours, observing, noting, and deciding what she would do next. What she had seen already told her several things. Doyle Garrett had influence. Men with influence don't make spectacles of themselves in the street without the confidence that the crowd is with them. The town was watching Ethan Callahan's private arrangements with the focused attention of people who had a stake in the outcome, which meant either that Callahan mattered enormously to the economic life of Blackwater Ridge, or that they resented him and wanted to see him fail, or both. The clerk in this office was nervous, which meant Callahan was the kind of employer whose moods were felt at a distance. None of this was encouraging. None of it made her want to leave. At 5 minutes past 6, the door opened. Ethan Callahan was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was tall. She registered that first, not because she was impressed by height, but because it reorganized the geometry of the small office. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of outdoor work and not from neglect. It was a face that had been exposed to things and had survived them, which gave it a quality that was harder to name than handsome, but more interesting. His eyes were dark gray and moved quickly, the eyes of someone accustomed to assessing situations in unfamiliar territory. He was carrying a hat in one hand and dust on every surface of his clothing, and he smelled like horses and cold air. He stopped when he saw her. Just stopped. Completely. In the way of someone who hadn't expected to find the room occupied. Then he looked at her the way the Kansas City rancher had looked at her on the train platform, and she felt her stomach tighten because she recognized that look. The calculating, involuntary, very fast assessment of a person deciding something. And she waited for the verdict. He didn't give one. He just said, "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Callahan." He moved to the desk, set his hat down, and remained standing rather than sitting, which she noted. "How was the journey?" "Long," she said. "Uneventful until town." He looked at her then with a focus that was different from before. "What happened in town?" She told him. Not in a dramatic way. She described it plainly. The wagon, the sign, Doyle Garrett's name, the 12 days remark. She watched his face as she spoke, and saw nothing there except a stillness that might have been anger or might have been something older and more settled than anger. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Garrett's got a long history of opinions about my business." "So I gathered." "Most of them wrong." She didn't respond to that. She waited. Callahan picked up his hat again, turned it once in his hands. A nervous gesture, she thought, though she wasn't certain it was nervousness, and looked at her with the directness that she'd noticed from the beginning, the kind of directness that seemed to be characteristic of him rather than performed. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "The agency sent me 2 women before you. I sent them both back." "I know," she said. "They told me." "Did they tell you why?" "No." He nodded slowly. "First one cried the second night. Not because anything happened to her, just the quiet," she said. "Couldn't take the quiet. Second one," he paused. "Second one was a good woman. Capable. She left after a week because she said she couldn't live with a man who wouldn't talk." He said this last part without apparent self-pity, which somehow made it more uncomfortable. "I'm telling you this so you understand what you're walking into." "A man who doesn't talk," Clara said, "and a lot of quiet. And hard work. Winter's coming. This ranch doesn't rest because the weather gets bad." "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I came from a town where everyone knew exactly what kind of life I'd have for the next 30 years, and none of them were wrong. I didn't come to Montana for easy." She let that sit for a second. "I came because I wanted a life I'd have to work for. If quiet and hard work are the worst of what you're offering, I've seen worse." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the weight of it. Then he said, "All right," and he put his hat back on and walked to the door. "I'll have Hector take you out to the ranch tonight. Mrs. Doyle, that's my housekeeper, no relation to the one in town. She'll show you your room." "Just like that?" she asked. He turned in the doorway. "You want more discussion?" "I want to know what happens in 12 days, she said. "The man in the street gave me 12 days. Ethan Callahan's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted. Something minute and hard to name. "Doyle Garrett's never been right about anything on my property," he said. "I wouldn't start trusting his estimates now." And then he left, and the door closed behind him, and the clerk exhaled from behind his ledger like he'd been holding his breath since the conversation started. Clara sat back in her chair. She looked at the closed door. She thought about this man who had just walked through it, the set of his shoulders, the stillness around him, the way he'd told her about the 2 previous women without making it a warning or an apology, just a fact. She thought about the sign in the mud, still there on the main street, slowly sinking. She had 12 days, according to Doyle Garrett. She had the rest of her life, according to herself. The wagon to the ranch left at dusk. The driver was Hector again. A different Hector, she would learn, from the one who'd brought her from the depot, though both of them shared the same quality of saying very little and meaning it. The road out of town was rough and dark came fast, and Clara sat with her suitcase on the bench beside her and watched the last of Blackwater Ridge's lamplight disappear behind the hills. The land around her was enormous. That was the only word for it. Enormous and dark and completely indifferent to the human beings moving through it, and she understood in a way she hadn't from reading about the frontier or hearing about it. She understood it in her body, in the back of her neck, in the particular silence that pressed against her ears, that this was not Ohio, that everything she knew how to do in Ohio was a foundation and not a ceiling, and the ceiling here was something she could not yet see. She was frightened. She would not have told anyone that. She picked up her suitcase when the wagon stopped in front of a long, low-built house with lamplight and 2 windows, and she carried it to the door, and she knocked. Mrs. Doyle, stout, 50s, with the face of a woman who had survived things through sheer practical force of will, opened the door, looked at Clara, and said nothing for a moment. Then she stepped back and said, come in out of the cold. It was not a welcome exactly, but it was a beginning. And Clara Whitmore, who had been rejected 3 times and mocked in the street, and given 12 days by a man with a hand-painted sign, stepped through the door with her suitcase and decided that a beginning was enough. For now. The first morning at Callahan Ranch began before the sun did. Clara heard movement in the house at 4:30. Boots on floorboards, the clank of a stove grate, the particular silence of a place waking itself up without ceremony. She had not slept well. The bed was adequate. The room was cold in the way that all frontier rooms were cold before the stove caught, and the quiet that Ethan Callahan had warned her about was not the quiet of an empty place, but the quiet of a place full of things she did not yet understand. Wind in grass, animals shifting in pens, the occasional sound from the bunkhouse 30 yards away where the ranch hands lived. It was a busy silence, which was somehow harder to sleep through than real silence would have been. She dressed in the dark and found the kitchen by the smell of coffee. Mrs. Doyle was already there, her gray hair pinned back with the efficiency of someone who had been doing the same thing every morning for 20 years and did not need a mirror to accomplish it. She looked at Clara when she came through the door, registered the fact that she was dressed and upright and not asking for anything, and turned back to the stove. "Coffee's on the shelf," she said. "Cups are above it." Clara found the cup and poured for herself and stood at the kitchen window while the coffee cooled enough to drink. Outside, the ranch yard was visible in the early gray light. A large, functional space. Nothing decorative about it. Every structure positioned with the logic of work, rather than appearance. The barn was the largest building after the main house. Beyond it, corrals, and beyond the corrals, the land just went, vast and flat at first, and then rising toward the dark suggestion of hills to the north. "He's already out," Mrs. Doyle said without being asked. "Has been since 4. North pasture fence came down in last night's wind. 3 hands with him." "Does that happen often?" Clara asked. "Often enough." Mrs. Doyle turned with a pan in her hand and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman taking an honest measurement. "You sleep?" "Some." "First week's hard, second week's harder, third week you stop counting." She set the pan on the stove. "The last woman cried every night for 6 days and then left without saying goodbye to anyone. I found her room empty on a Tuesday." "I'm not her," Clara said. "No," Mrs. Doyle said. "I can see that." She didn't say it like a compliment. She said it like a fact she was recording for future reference, which Clara found, unexpectedly, more comforting than a compliment would have been. The ranch hands came in for breakfast at 6. 5 of them, a mix of ages, all wearing the particular expression of men who have already done 2 hours of physical work and are prepared to judge anyone who hasn't. They filed into the kitchen, saw Clara, and the conversation that had been running low among them stopped. Not rudely exactly, just stopped. A young one, barely 20, with straw-colored hair and a gap between his front teeth, stared at her for 3 seconds too long before an older hand elbowed him without looking up from his own plate. The older man, gray at his temples, permanent squint lines around his eyes, said, "Morning," to Clara in a tone that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, just functional, the way you'd address a new piece of equipment that hadn't proven itself yet. His name, she would learn, was Walt. He had been with Callahan 11 years, which in the world of the ranch meant something closer to tenure than employment. Ethan came in at 6:40. He was muddier than the night before, which she hadn't thought was possible, and there was a cut on his left hand that had been wrapped in cloth but was still seeping through. He sat at the head of the table, poured his own coffee, and ate without speaking for several minutes, and nobody at the table seemed to find this unusual. Then he looked up and said, "Fence is patched. North herd still short 4 head. Walt, take Reeves and Cortez and sweep the South Creek before it gets cold." Walt nodded. No discussion. Ethan looked at Clara then, not the way he'd looked at her the night before, but more briefly, like a man checking something off a list. "Mrs. Doyle show you around yesterday?" "The house, yes." "She'll take you through the outbuildings this morning. You'll want to know where things are before the real cold comes." He said this not unkindly, but not warmly either, the way you'd instruct someone you'd hired for a specific function and expected to learn it quickly. "What would you like me to start on?" she asked. He paused with his cup halfway to his mouth. "What?" "Work," she said. "I'd like to know what's most useful to start on. The house, the accounts, correspondence, wherever the gap is." Ethan set his cup down. Something shifted in his face. Not softer exactly, but recalibrated. He looked at her for a moment the way he might look at a fence line that was not behaving according to its expected geometry. "The accounts can wait," he said finally. "Get the lay of the place first. You can't manage what you can't see." It was the most words he had strung together since she arrived. She filed that away too. The morning was cold enough that her breath showed as she followed Mrs. Doyle through the outbuildings. The smokehouse, the root cellar, the equipment shed, the chicken coop, the secondary water pump that served the barn. Mrs. Doyle explained each one with the compressed efficiency of someone who had explained it many times and seen many listeners forget it. Clara asked specific questions. How often was the root cellar inventory counted? Who kept the equipment manifest? What was the schedule for the water pump's maintenance? And Mrs. Doyle answered each one with slightly increasing attention, the way a teacher pays more attention to a student who is taking notes. "You've managed a household before," Mrs. Doyle said. It wasn't quite a question. "My father's store," Clara said. "Inventory, accounts, correspondence. Some of the larger orders he let me negotiate." "This isn't a store." "No, it's larger and more complicated, and I don't know it yet." She paused at the door of the equipment shed, looking at the organized rows of tools, the handwritten labels on crates and shelves. "Who does the manifest?" "Callahan, mostly. Walt when he's away." "Are they current?" Mrs. Doyle gave her a look. "What makes you ask that?" "The labels on those crates," Clara said. "3 of them have dates from 2 years ago. If the manifest was current, the dates would be closer." A pause. Mrs. Doyle's expression did something complicated. Not quite respect, not quite surprise, something between the two that hadn't decided what it was yet. "Ethan's been busy," she said. "I can see that," Clara said. "I'm not criticizing. I'm looking for where I'm useful." She found out where she was not useful at around noon, when she made the mistake of being in the main corral, when one of the hands, Cortez, brought in a horse that had thrown a shoe and was moving wrong on its left foreleg. Everything happened quickly. Cortez calling to Walt, Walt coming fast, the horse nervous and moving sideways in the pen. And Clara was standing exactly where she shouldn't have been, directly in the path of a 1,400-pound animal that had decided it was done cooperating. Walt grabbed her arm and pulled her back against the corral fence in one motion, not roughly, but with the absolute certainty of someone who didn't have time to be careful about feelings. The horse moved past her, close enough that she felt the air shift. "Stay out of the pens," Walt said. Not angry, just factual. "I know," she said. Her heart was going at twice its normal speed, and she was annoyed at herself for not having anticipated it. "I wasn't paying attention." Walt looked at her for a moment. Most of the hands she had noticed looked at her with a kind of guarded wariness, waiting for her to do something wrong so they could confirm the thing they already believed, which was that she didn't belong here. Walt's look was different. It was the look of a man who was revising something, very slowly and with a great deal of reluctance. "Most women would have screamed," he said. "I don't scream much," she said, which was mostly true. Walt made a sound that was not quite a laugh and went back to the horse. That afternoon, Ethan came back to the house for an hour to go over something with his ledger, and Clara was at the kitchen table with the equipment manifest she had found in the office and a fresh sheet of paper beside it. She had been going through it for 40 minutes. He stopped in the doorway when he saw what she was doing. "What's that?" he said. "Your manifest from the equipment shed. I'm cross-referencing it with what's actually on the shelves." She looked up. "There are 11 items on here that are no longer there, and 4 items in the shed that aren't on here. Thought you'd want to know." Ethan came to the table and looked over her shoulder at the paper. She could feel him reading it, could feel the precise quality of his attention, which was the same attention she'd noticed the night before, focused and without waste. "The auger's been broken 2 years," he said. "Never got around to removing it from the list." "I put it in the discard column," she said. "The other 10 items, 3 of them I can't account for. 7 were moved to the Reeves bunkhouse, according to the note on page 4 of the ledger, but they're not noted as transferred in the manifest." Silence. He was still reading. "The 4 unlisted items are 2 extra saddle blankets, 1 wagon wheel rim, and what I believe is a replacement gear for the water pump, though I'm not certain because the casing is different from the pump itself. You'd need to verify." Ethan straightened. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not warm, not approving exactly, but genuinely surprised in a way that he had not bothered to conceal, which surprised her in turn because he was not a man who easily betrayed what he was thinking. "You did this in an afternoon," he said. "The shed was organized," she said. "It made it easier." He picked up the paper she'd written and looked at it for another moment. Then he set it down and said, "The pump gear. The casing's different because it was ordered for the secondary pump, not the main. They run different specs. Gear's correct." He paused. "The 3 missing items were taken by a hand who quit last spring. I know which ones they are." "I can note that in the manifest." "Do that." He moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "Where'd you learn to organize like this?" "My father's store," she said again. "I've been saying it since I got here. People keep being surprised." He made a sound. Not a laugh, but not a laugh either. "Millhaven, Ohio," he said. "Doesn't sound like it was big enough to need that kind of system." "No," she said. "It wasn't. But I needed somewhere to put the work." He looked at her then. A longer look, the kind that goes past the surface of a thing. Then he turned and went back out, and the door closed behind him, and Clara sat with her manifest and her paper and the afternoon light coming through the window, and she did not let herself think about that look for too long because there was more work to do, and she had learned a long time ago that thinking about a thing before you understood it was the fastest way to understand it wrong. 2 days later, Doyle Garrett came to the ranch. He didn't ride alone. He came with 2 other men, both of them wearing the particular expression of men who have accompanied someone with status and have adopted the status secondhand. Clara was in the yard when they rode in, carrying a bucket from the pump house to the garden. Mrs. Doyle kept on the east side of the house, mostly root vegetables this time of year, half of them already pulled for the cellar. She straightened when she heard the horses and watched the 3 men dismount. Garrett was bigger than she remembered, or maybe it was just the open space that made him seem larger. He had the kind of physical presence that comes from years of using size to settle arguments before they became arguments. He looked at Clara, and his grin arrived immediately, automatic as a reflex. "Well," he said. "Still here." "Still here," she said. "What's it been? 4 days?" He looked at the men with him. "I said 12. 4 might have been generous." He turned back to her. "Callahan around?" "I'll get him," she said, which was not the same as asking his permission, and she could see that he noticed the distinction and did not like it. She found Ethan in the barn with Walt, going over the condition of the winter tack, and told him Garrett was in the yard. Something moved through his face when she said the name. A tightening, controlled quickly. "How many with him?" 2. He set down the bridle he'd been examining and went out without putting on his coat, which she understood was deliberate. A statement of some kind, the kind that gets made in the language of frontiermen and doesn't need explaining. She followed at a distance, not because she had been invited, but because she was not going to stay in the barn. The conversation between Ethan and Garrett began with the particular false warmth that men use when they dislike each other, and have decided not to say so directly. Garrett had a piece of land to the southwest of Callahan's range, a wedge of about 300 acres that contained a creek that fed into Callahan's water supply during spring runoff. There had been a dispute about it for years, longer than Clara had been anywhere near Montana. She gathered this from what was said, and more from what wasn't. "Just wanted to be neighborly," Garrett said. "Check on your new arrangement." He glanced at Clara where she'd come to stand near the corner of the fence. "Make sure she's settling in all right." "She's fine," Ethan said. "Good, good." Garrett's grin widened. "We had a pool going in town. About when she'd leave. Not meaning any disrespect to the lady." "Then stop talking," Ethan said, "and tell me what you actually came here for." The grin didn't disappear, but it thinned. "Came to let you know I've had a surveyor out on the southwest line. Turns out there may be a question about where that property boundary runs. Near the creek." Silence. The kind that has weight. "There's no question about where that line runs," Ethan said. "It's been filed since 1879. "Surveyor thinks otherwise," Garrett said. "We'll see what the county recorder has to say." He shrugged, the gesture of a man who has already won an argument he hasn't quite started yet. "Could be nothing. Could be the creek's been on my side of the line all along." He looked at Clara again. "You picked yourself a complicated time to arrive, miss." Clara looked back at him steadily. I've noticed that the times that look complicated usually look that way because someone's making them that way, she said, not because they are. Garrett's grin went away entirely. It was the first time she had seen his face without it, and the face beneath was considerably less friendly than the grin had suggested. You got a talky one, he said to Ethan, without looking at her anymore. She's right, Ethan said. Boundaries filed. Survey or no survey, the creek is where it is. You know that. We'll let the county sort it out. Garrett put his hat back on. Neighborly visit, no hard feelings. He remounted with his men and rode out without looking back. When they were gone, Ethan stood in the yard for a moment. Clara came to stand beside him, not close, just adjacent, the way you stand with someone when you are not yet sure what the distance between you should be. He's going to challenge the boundary, she said. He's been trying to for 3 years, Ethan said. Never had anything solid enough to take to the county before. Does he now? Ethan looked at the place where Garrett's horses had been, as if the ground might still hold some information. He's hired a surveyor. That's new. Do you have your original filings? She asked. He looked at her. Of course I have my filings. Where? A pause. Office. In the case file on the south shelf. Is everything in there current, updated with every boundary change or transfer since 1879? The pause that followed was longer than the first one. Most of it. Clara said nothing to that. She didn't need to. She turned and walked back toward the house, and Ethan stood in the yard and watched her go, and she could feel him working through the same arithmetic she'd just done. She started on the land records that evening after dinner. The file on the south shelf of the office was not in bad shape, exactly. It was in the shape of a man who had kept everything but organized it according to the logic of his own memory, which meant it was completely opaque to anyone who wasn't him. She went through it piece by piece, making a separate log of each document. Date, type, filing status, what county office it corresponded to, whether the filing had been confirmed or was simply a copy of the original submission. It took until 11 o'clock, which was later than anyone else in the house was awake. The lamp burned low twice, and she turned it up twice and kept going. What she found at the bottom of the file, behind a folder of receipts that had been placed there by accident or intention, was a letter. Dated March 1881. Written from a county land recorder's office in Helena. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat with it for a long moment. The letter was a notice of a filing discrepancy, a clerical error made when Callahan's original boundary survey had been transcribed into the county record. The error was small, a coordinate notation that placed the southwest boundary marker 200 yards east of where the actual marker stood in the ground. 200 yards east put the creek on the wrong side of the line, on Garrett's side. It was exactly the discrepancy that Garrett's surveyor had found. The question was whether Garrett had found it on his own or whether someone had pointed him to it. The second question was whether Callahan knew. She sat with that question for a while. The fire in the stove had gone low, and she could feel the cold coming through the wall. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could hear it working at the corners of the house, that particular tone that meant temperature dropping. She folded the letter and held it in her hands. She was not the kind of person who made fast decisions about complicated things, which some people had mistaken for slowness and others had understood correctly as precision. She thought about Ethan Callahan, who had told her about 2 previous women without apology and had looked at her manifest notes with genuine surprise and had gone out to face Garrett without his coat. She thought about the man who kept imperfect records, not because he was careless, but because he was one person trying to manage too many things at once. She put the letter on top of the organized stack of documents. She was going to have to show him, not tonight. It was after 11 and she could hear that the house had been fully quiet for an hour. Tomorrow. She banked the stove, turned out the lamp, and went to her room. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about the 200 yards and what they were worth, and whether Garrett had been working toward this moment for 3 years or longer. She thought about what it would take to fight it. Not the physical fight, the legal fight, the kind that happens in county offices and involves documents and timelines and the ability to prove something that someone else is actively trying to disprove. She had never fought that kind of fight, but she had spent her whole life in the details of things. Documents, figures, correspondence, the exact wording of agreements. She had grown up in a dry goods store, tracking the difference between what was promised and what was delivered, and she had a precise, unhurried memory for recorded information. Whatever Garrett thought he had found, she intended to find first. She was awake before 4 again. She had the documents in order on the kitchen table before Mrs. Doyle came down, arranged chronologically and cross-referenced with the log she'd built the night before. When Mrs. Doyle saw it, she stopped in the doorway and looked at the table and then at Clara with an expression that had stopped trying to conceal what it was. "You've been up all night," Mrs. Doyle said. "I slept some," Clara said. "Not much. There's something in those files he needs to know about." Mrs. Doyle came to the table and looked at the organized documents without touching them. Then she looked at Clara's face, the shadows under her eyes, the set of her jaw. "He's not going to like it," she said. "Probably not. He doesn't like problems he hasn't seen coming." "Nobody does," Clara said. "The question is what you do with them when they arrive." Mrs. Doyle went to the stove and started the coffee without another word, which was, Clara had come to understand, her version of respect. Ethan came in at 5:30. He saw the table, saw the documents, saw Clara's face. He said nothing for a moment, just read the room the way he seemed to read everything, quickly, accurately, without performance. "You found something," he said. "Yes." She pushed the letter across the table. "Sit down." He didn't sit. He took the letter and read it standing, the way he did everything. She watched his face. He read it once fast, then again slowly, and the second time she could see the specific moment the implication arrived. A stillness across his shoulders, a very slight change in his breathing. "I didn't know about this," he said. "I know," she said. He looked up from the letter. "How do you know?" "Because if you'd known, you would have fixed it. It's been 3 years since that letter. You wouldn't have sat on it." She paused. "Someone filed it in the wrong folder. It was behind the receipts, easy to miss." He set the letter down. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at the organized stacks of documents and did not say anything for a long moment. "Garrett knows," he said. "Garrett knows," she confirmed. "Or someone told him. The surveyor's results will match this discrepancy exactly. When he takes it to the county, they'll have a legitimate question about the boundary." "The marker's in the ground," Ethan said. "The physical marker is in the right place, 200 yards west of where that coordinate says it is." "Physical markers get disputed," Clara said. "Without matching documentation, the county goes with the recorded coordinates." He pushed back from the table. He moved to the window and stood looking out at the yard with his back to her. And she let him be there for a minute because some things need a moment, and pushing against that moment doesn't help. Then he said, "What do we do?" She noticed the we. She didn't say anything about it. "We go to Helena," she said, "before Garrett does. We go to the county recorder's office with the original survey. You have the original survey?" "Locked box in the office. Yes." "We go with the original survey, the original filing receipt, and a timeline showing that the error was clerical and that the physical marker has stood unchallenged since 1879. We file a correction. We get it entered into the record before Garrett's surveyor report arrives." She paused. "How long will it take Garrett to finalize a survey report and get it to Helena?" Ethan turned from the window. "Surveyor was out last week. Week to 10 days for the report, maybe. Then however long it takes Garrett to get to Helena, which he won't do himself, he'll send a lawyer." "How long by horse to Helena?" "Hard riding, 2 days, stages 3. Clara looked at the letter on the table. "We should leave tomorrow morning." Ethan looked at her. "You're coming?" "You need someone who has read every document in that file and can speak to the organizational history if the recorder asks questions," she said. "I've read every document in that file. You need me there." He held her gaze. She did not look away. This was the kind of moment she had learned to hold still in. The moment where a person decides whether you are what you appear to be or whether they're going to spend another week testing it. "All right," he said. "I'll have the documents organized for travel by tonight," she said. "Waterproof satchel if you have one." He went to the office and came back with a worn leather satchel with a buckle closure. He set it on the table beside the documents and looked at the organized stacks with an expression she had not seen from him before. Something between discomfort and acknowledgement, the look of a person who has been helped in a way they hadn't anticipated needing to be helped. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She registered it without showing that she had. "This is good work," he said, "finding this." "It was in your files," she said. "I just read them." He nodded once, which for Ethan Callahan she was beginning to understand was what most people meant by a full sentence, and he took his coffee and went back outside. Walt appeared in the kitchen doorway not 30 seconds later, which told her he had been within earshot of at least part of that conversation. He looked at the table. He looked at Clara. "Helena?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said. Walt looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You know, we had a bet in the bunkhouse, when you'd be gone by." "I know," she said. 12 days, according to Garrett." "I said 3 weeks," Walt said. "Cortez said 2 months. A pause. "Reeves said you weren't going anywhere." She looked at him. "Who's Reeves?" "Young one. Straw hair, stares too much." "Smart kid," she said. Walt made that sound again. The one that wasn't quite a laugh, but was getting closer to it every time she heard it. He poured himself a cup of coffee and went back to the yard, and Clara turned back to the documents and continued working, and the house settled into the sounds of its morning around her like it was beginning, very slowly and with no ceremony at all, to accept that she was in it. Outside, the wind had died from the night before. The sky to the north was a hard, particular blue, the kind that looks beautiful and means cold is coming. She had a satchel to pack. She had 2 days of hard riding ahead of her, documents to organize, and a man she barely knew to travel with through territory she had never seen. She had a boundary dispute to win before someone else won it first. She pulled the next document from the stack and kept reading. They left before sunrise, which meant the yard was dark and the horse's breath showed in the cold air, and nobody said much because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said. Ethan had the leather satchel strapped across his saddle. Clara had her smaller bag with 2 days of clothing and the duplicate log she'd written out by hand the previous evening. Every document in the file, summarized and cross-referenced, in case the originals were questioned and she needed to speak to them from memory. Walt stood at the barn door and watched them go. He didn't say anything. Neither did Ethan. Clara gave Walt a nod as she rode past, and he returned it with the slight, serious tilt of a man who had revised his opinion of a person and was still getting used to the revision. The road to Helena was not a road in the way that Ohio had roads. It was a track, mostly. A set of parallel impressions in the land made by enough wagons and horses over enough years that the grass had given up trying to grow back. It ran northeast through low hills and then opened into a long valley that Ethan said would take most of the first day to cross. The sky was clear and absolutely cold, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself but simply is, present in every breath and in the particular way the light fell on the frozen grass. Ethan rode slightly ahead, which she didn't take personally. He was the kind of person who led from the front, not from ego, but from habit, from years of being the one who knew where he was going. He rode well, easily, without thinking about it, the way people move through spaces they've moved through 10,000 times. Clara rode adequately. She had learned in Ohio, which meant she could stay in the saddle for a full day without embarrassing herself. But she had no illusions about the quality of her horsemanship compared to anyone who had grown up doing it in terrain like this. The horse she'd been given was a gray mare named Della, who had a calm, business-like temperament and seemed to regard the journey as something to be completed rather than enjoyed, which Clara respected. They rode in silence for the first hour, which was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who are still learning what the other person does with quiet, and neither of them had decided yet whether to fill it. Ethan broke it first. "You ride better than I expected," he said, without turning around. "You expected badly?" she said. "I expected Ohio," he said. "Ohio has horses." "Ohio has flat roads and mild weather," he said. "That's different from this." She considered pointing out that they were not yet in the difficult part of the terrain, but let it go. He was trying, in his way, to say something that wasn't criticism, and she had learned that with certain people you needed to receive the effort rather than the execution. "I'll manage," she said. He glanced back at her once, just once, quickly, and then faced forward again. The first real conversation happened at midday, when they stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses and eat the food Mrs. Doyle had packed: hard bread, dried meat, 2 apples that were past their best but still good. They sat on opposite sides of the creek bank without discussing where to sit, which told her something about both of them. "Tell me about the recorder's office," she said. "What to expect?" Ethan bit into his apple. "Man named Hoskins. 30 years in the office, meticulous. He does not like being told he made an error, even when the error was made by someone who had the job before him. Does he respond better to documentation or to argument? Documentation, Ethan said, without hesitation. He's an evidence man. You put it in front of him clearly, he'll act on it. You try to talk him into something, he digs in. Then we don't argue, she said. We present. That's the plan. She pulled the duplicate log from her bag and turned to the section she'd marked. The original survey is dated August 1879. The county filing receipt is dated September of the same year. The letter about the transcription error is dated March 1881. That's 18 months between filing and error notification. Long enough that the original surveyor may have moved on, but the survey itself should still be in the county archive. Ethan looked at the log. She held it out, and he took it, reading through her notations with the same focused attention he'd given the manifest 2 days ago. You noted the chain of custody, he said. Every document that passed through your office is logged with the date it arrived and what action was taken, if any. For most of them, action was taken. She paused. For the letter about the transcription error, there's no note, no date stamp of receipt, no response filed, which means either it never reached you or it reached you and got misfiled immediately. I never saw it, he said. I know, she said again. He looked up from the log with an expression she was becoming familiar with, that particular flatness that meant he was thinking about something that made him uncomfortable and had chosen to think about it anyway, rather than not. You keep saying that, he said, that you know. Because I do, she said. If you'd seen that letter, there would be a response in the file. You keep records. Imperfect records, but records. There's no response because you never wrote one. Most people would have assumed I was hiding it, he said, that I knew about the discrepancy and ignored it. She looked at him steadily. Most people would have assumed that before they read the file. I read the file. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he handed the log back to her and stood up, brushing apple off his coat. We should move. Want to make the Ridley Creek camp before dark. She put the log away and stood, and they watered the horses and rode on, and the afternoon light came in low and golden and cold across the valley. And Clara thought about what he'd said. Most people would have assumed, and what it meant that he'd said it to her. It meant he was watching to see if she was like most people. It meant he had not yet decided. She thought that was fair. She had not yet decided about him either. They made Ridley Creek Camp as the last light went. It was a rough camp, a fire ring with evidence of heavy previous use, a lean-to structure that had been repaired several times with varying quality of wood, enough flat ground for 2 bedrolls with a fire between them. Ethan had it set up with the efficient, unhurried speed of someone who had camped in worse places in worse weather, and Clara helped where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't, which she had decided was the most useful approach to the things she didn't yet know. The fire was good. She was colder than she'd let herself acknowledge during the ride, and the heat reached her in stages, first her hands, then her face, then slowly the rest of her, and she sat across from Ethan and drank the coffee he'd made in a battered tin pot and felt the day settle in her bones. Tell me about Garrett, she said. Ethan looked at the fire. What about him? How long has he been trying to take the creek? Since I bought the Halverson parcel in '78, he said. That's the parcel that sits between my original range and Garrett's land. Before I bought it, the creek was uncontested. It ran through Halverson's land. Nobody disputed whose water rights were whose. When I bought Halverson out, Garrett decided the creek should have been his all along. Was there any legitimate claim? Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. There was a period in the early settlement days when the boundaries in that area weren't surveyed properly. Garrett's father made a verbal agreement with Halverson about water access during dry years. When Halverson sold to me, Garrett tried to argue that the water access agreement transferred with the land, meaning I owed him access to the creek even though I owned the parcel. But an informal agreement doesn't transfer with title, she said. Correct. County said the same. Garrett dropped it then. He turned a stick in the fire, not looking at her. He never forgot it. And now he's found a clerical error in your survey transcript, and he's going to use it to argue the boundary was never correctly established in the first place, she said. That's his play, Ethan said. If the recorded coordinate is east of where the marker stands, he'll argue the marker was placed incorrectly, and the creek is on his side of the true line. He'd have to prove the marker was placed wrong, Clara said. The marker's been there since 1879, unchallenged for 13 years. He's going to say Halverson placed it wrong on purpose to maximize what he sold me. She thought about that. It was not an impossible argument. It was even slightly clever, in the way that arguments built on old uncertainty are clever. They're hard to disprove because the people who could disprove them are often dead or gone. Is Halverson still alive? She asked. Moved to Oregon in '85, Ethan said. Alive as far as I know. Can we reach him? Ethan looked at her. What for? If Garrett argues the marker was placed wrong by Halverson, Halverson's testimony about where he understood the boundary to be when he sold you the parcel would be relevant, she said. It wouldn't be legally decisive on its own, but it would complicate Garrett's argument. The fire popped. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp, an animal moved through grass. You're thinking like a lawyer, Ethan said. I'm thinking like someone who has to win an argument with documentation instead of authority, she said. I don't have authority here. Neither does the paper I made. What I have is the ability to build a case that's harder to attack than whatever Garrett brings. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Halverson's in Portland. I have a postal address from a Christmas card 3 years ago. No guarantee it's current. Write to him tonight, she said. I'll draft the letter. We can post it from Helena. He looked at her across the fire. She could not read his expression precisely in the firelight. It was a different kind of illegible from his usual reserve, something more open and less certain, which she was not used to seeing from him. You've been on this ranch for less than 2 weeks, he said. 6 days, she said. 6 days. And you found a document I'd missed for 3 years, organized my equipment manifest, and are now planning legal strategy for a boundary dispute. Yes, she said. That bothers you? No, he said. Then, more carefully, I don't know what it does. She looked at him. I'm useful to you, Mr. Callahan. That's all. You can let that be simple. It's not simple, he said. Why not? He picked up the tin pot and refilled his cup, taking longer about it than necessary. Because the last time I let myself depend on something, it went wrong, he said. And I've spent 6 years making sure not to be in a position where that could happen again. She waited to see if there was more. There was. My wife, he said, flatly. She left in '86, took our son. He was 3. He drank his coffee. Not because I was cruel to her, because she couldn't stand the isolation, and I couldn't give up the ranch, and neither of us was wrong, exactly, and that made it worse. Clara looked at the fire for a moment. She had known there was something in his past. The 2 previous mail-order women had told her that much, indirectly, and the quality of his silence carried the specific weight of a man who had decided that close relationships were risks he could manage by avoiding. She had known, but hearing it stated plainly was different. How old would he be now? She asked. Ethan looked at his cup. 9. A pause that cost him something. 9 in March. She did not say she was sorry, because she had always found that particular phrase inadequate in the way that a teaspoon of water is inadequate for a fire. The gesture is correct in principle, but wrong in scale. She said, Does he know where you are? She remarried, Ethan said. Man in St. Louis. I get a letter once a year, around Christmas. From her, not from him. He's too young to write much. Another pause. She sends a photograph sometimes. Clara did not say anything else for a while. The fire settled. The cold was absolute and complete around the ring of warmth they'd built, and she was aware of how far they were from the nearest other human being, and how the dark land around them created a particular kind of honesty that towns didn't allow. I'm not going to leave, she said. He looked at her. I'm telling you because you seem to be deciding whether to trust something that might leave, she said. And I want to give you accurate information to work with. I'm not going to leave. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I do. But because I came here to build a life, and I've started building one, and I don't leave things I've started. Ethan looked at her for a long time. Long enough that the fire popped twice and the horses shifted in their picket lines. You've been here 6 days, he said again. But this time it wasn't the same sentence. This time there was something in it that was closer to a question than a statement. Ask me again in 6 months, she said. She pulled her bedroll closer to the fire and settled in, and she didn't look at him again, and he didn't say anything else, and the night was cold and wide and very quiet, and somewhere in it she slept without meaning to and did not dream. Helena was exactly what she had expected from a territorial capital, and also not at all what she'd expected, because the idea of a city after 6 days on a frontier ranch is a relative thing. It had buildings of 2 and 3 stories. It had a proper street grid, or something approaching one. It had a hotel with actual lamps and a dining room that served meals from a printed menu, and she stood in the lobby after they checked in and felt the particular strangeness of a person returning to civilization from the wilderness after not enough time away to have fully adapted to the wilderness, but enough time to have started. The county recorder's office opened at 8 in the morning. They were there at 5 past. Hoskins was exactly as Ethan had described. A compact, dry-mannered man in his late 50s, with the quality of a person who had spent decades processing other people's errors and had developed a specific emotional register for it. Not unkind, but precise in the way that a scalpel is precise, the kind of precision that does not allow for imprecision to exist comfortably in the same room. He looked at Ethan with the recognition of a man who had dealt with this particular rancher before and had opinions about it. And he looked at Clara with the particular blankness that men of his generation and type used when they were not sure what category a woman occupied. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I didn't expect to see you." "I imagine not," Ethan said. "This is Clara Whitmore. She's been managing my records." Hoskins looked at her again, a small recalibration. "Miss Whitmore." "Mr. Hoskins," she said, "we'd like to file a correction to a transcription error in the county record for the Callahan Southwest Boundary Survey. We have the original documents." She set the satchel on the counter and opened it. "The filing will take about 20 minutes of your time if you have it." He looked at the satchel. He looked at her. What error? She placed the documents on the counter in the order she'd organized them. Original survey, original filing receipt, the county's own letter from 1881 acknowledging receipt of the filing, and then, last, the letter about the transcription error. She explained each one in sequence, clearly and without drama, the way you present facts that don't require drama to be compelling. She pointed to the coordinate discrepancy. She explained the chain of custody. She noted that the physical marker had stood at the correct location since 1879 and had never been challenged. Hoskins read each document. He read them the way he read everything, she suspected, methodically, without hurrying, with the stillness of a man who had learned that the detail you skip is always the detail that matters. He went back twice to the original survey. He compared the coordinate notation to the county's record. When he finished, he set the documents down and looked at the wall for a moment that was so brief she might have imagined it. "This is a clerical error," he said. "Yes," she said, "made in this office." The letter suggests the error was in transcription from the original to the county record. The original is correct. The recorded copy is not. Hoskins looked at Ethan. "Why wasn't this corrected in 81 when the notice was sent?" "The notice misfiled in our records," Ethan said. "We found it last week." "Misfiled for 11 years. Yes." A pause. Hoskins' expression did not change in the way most people's expressions change. He didn't wince or frown or look apologetic. He simply processed. "I'll need to pull the original transcription record from our archive," he said. "Verify the discrepancy on our end." "Of course," Clara said. "We can wait." He went through this door behind the counter and was gone for 17 minutes. Clara and Ethan stood at the counter and did not talk. There was nothing to say that would improve the situation. Either the archive confirmed what they had, or it didn't, and talking about it wouldn't change which one was true. When Hoskins returned, he had a folder. He set it on the counter and opened it and compared it side by side with the original survey. Clara watched his face. There was a moment, she saw it exactly, when the confirmation arrived in his expression, a very slight tightening around his eyes, the look of a meticulous man confronting a meticulous error. "The transcription error is confirmed," he said. "The recorded coordinate is incorrect. The original survey is controlling." He turned to a fresh form on the side of the counter and picked up his pen. "I'll file the correction today. It will be entered into the official record by end of week." Clara exhaled. She did it quietly, through her nose, because the relief was real and she didn't want it to be visible. "Are you aware of any pending challenges to this boundary?" she asked, "specifically from the adjacent landowner to the southwest." Hoskins looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "I am not at liberty to discuss pending filings from other parties," which told her everything she needed to know. There was a pending filing. Garrett had moved faster than they'd calculated, or had been moving in parallel without their knowledge. They had beaten it. Barely, or perhaps not, depending on what the pending filing contained and when it had arrived. When a correction is filed to an existing record, she said carefully, and a subsequent challenge to that record has already been submitted, which takes precedence? Hoskins set his pen down. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory. The correction, if supported by original documentation, supersedes any challenge based on the erroneous record, he said, provided the correction is filed first. And we are filing first, she said. You are filing first, he said. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him at all until this moment. Not the calculation, not the careful reserve, not the flatness that covered what he was thinking. It was something more exposed than any of those, and it lasted for only a second before he looked away. But she had seen it. Thank you, Mr. Hoskins, she said. They filed the correction. Hoskins issued a receipt. They walked out of the county recorder's office into the cold Helena morning, and Clara stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed the cold air and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing that was complicated becoming simple because someone had paid attention to it. Ethan stood beside her. After a moment he said, Garrett's lawyer has already filed something. I know, she said. We may have beaten it by a day, maybe less. We beat it, she said. That's what matters. He looked down the street where the territorial capital went about its morning business with the noise and density of a place that hadn't decided yet whether it was a big town or a small city. You handled Hoskins better than I would have, he said. I would have argued. You didn't argue once. You told me he responds to documentation, she said. I gave him documentation. I told you that. You executed it. He paused. That's different. She looked at him. He was looking at the street still, not at her, and she thought that might be why he was saying it, because looking at the street made it easier. Thank you, he said, for the work, for coming here. She didn't say it was nothing, because it wasn't nothing. She didn't say she was glad to help, because it was more than that too. She said, let's post the letter to Halverson before we leave, in case Garrett finds another angle. He looked at her then. That same exposed expression briefly before the reserve settled back over it. You're already thinking about the next thing, he said. I'm always thinking about the next thing, she said. That's not a virtue. It's just how I'm built. It's a virtue here, he said. They found the post office and sent the letter to Portland. Then they ate a hot meal at the hotel dining room, the first hot meal served by someone else in 6 days. And Clara ate more than she intended to because she was hungrier than she'd realized, and Ethan ate without comment and ordered a second cup of coffee and looked out the window at the street with the expression of a man who has been holding a problem for a long time and has just set it down and isn't sure yet what to do with his hands now that they're empty. The ride back took the better part of 2 days, the same camp at Ridley Creek, the same cold, the same particular honesty that distance from other people creates. They talked more on the way back, not about the boundary dispute, which had been handled, but about smaller things, the ranch, the coming winter, the cattle breeds. Ethan had shifted toward in the last 3 years, and why. He explained things to her with the careful precision of someone who wasn't sure yet how much the listener knew, but had decided to err on the side of completeness rather than simplification, which she appreciated. She told him about Mill Haven, about her father's store, about the suppliers who'd underestimated her, about the specific pleasure of catching a billing error that everyone else had missed. He listened the way he did everything, completely, without interrupting, processing before responding. You could have done this anywhere, he said. Account work, record management. You didn't need to come to Montana. No, she said. Then why? She thought about how to say it accurately. Because in Mill Haven, I knew exactly what the rest of my life would look like, she said. And it wasn't bad. It just wasn't. It wasn't mine. It was the life that fit the space I was in. I wanted to find out what kind of life I could build if the space was bigger. He was quiet for a moment, writing. And is it bigger? She looked at the horizon ahead of them. The hills to the north, the enormous undecorated sky, the land that went further than she could see and didn't apologize for it. Yes, she said. When they rode back into the Callahan ranch yard on the evening of the 4th day, Walt was waiting. He had the specific posture of a man trying not to appear to have been waiting, but who had very clearly been waiting. He looked at both of them. He read the situation from their faces. the absence of disaster, the quality of Ethan's silence, which was different from the silence he'd left with. He looked at the satchel strapped to the saddle and the way it was buckled, which told him the documents had been used and returned. "Well?" he said. "Filed and corrected," Ethan said, dismounting. "Garrett's going to hear about it by end of week." Walt looked at Clara. She handed Della's reins to Reeves, who had appeared from the direction of the barn with the reliable timing of someone who had been watching for their return. "Told you," Reeves said, to nobody in particular. "Shut up, Reeves," Walt said, but there was nothing in it. Mrs. Doyle had dinner on the stove. She had known, somehow, that they would be back that evening, which Clara was beginning to understand was simply one of Mrs. Doyle's capabilities, an accurate internal sense of time and distance that she applied without ceremony. The kitchen was warm and the food was real food, and Clara sat at the kitchen table and ate while the day came off her in layers. She was halfway through dinner when the first sound reached them from outside. A low, unusual sound. Not wind, not the normal animal noise of the ranch settling for the night, something off in the register. Mrs. Doyle's head came up. Ethan set his fork down. Walt opened the back door and stood for a moment, looking north. "Storm," he said, "coming fast." Clara looked at the window. The sky to the north had changed in the 2 hours since they'd ridden in. What had been the hard, clear blue of a cold day had become something darker and more opaque, a color that was not quite black and not quite gray, but had the quality of a ceiling coming down. Ethan was already moving. Walt was behind him. Clara stood from the table and followed, and Mrs. Doyle didn't tell her not to, which was its own kind of statement. Outside, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees since they'd unsaddled the horses. Clara felt it immediately. Not the gradual cold of a cooling evening, but the sudden, total cold of a weather system arriving without negotiating. The wind came with it from the north, the kind of wind that doesn't gust and drop, but simply establishes itself, a constant pressure that leaned against you and made clear it intended to stay. Ethan stood in the yard looking north. In the failing light, the hills to the north had disappeared entirely behind what was moving toward them. "How many head on the North Range?" Clara asked Walt. He looked at her. "Maybe 250. We moved them south last week, but—" He stopped. "Maybe 200 still north of the creek." "That's the same creek," she said. "Garrett's side now borders it." Walt looked at Ethan. Something passed between them. "If the herd moves in the storm," Ethan said, "they'll push toward water. If they push north, they'll end up on contested ground," Clara said. "Not contested anymore," Ethan said. "We filed the correction." "Garrett doesn't know that yet," Walt said. The wind hit them harder then, a gust that was actually a sustained increase, the kind that rewrites your understanding of what the baseline was. Somewhere in the north pasture, cattle were beginning to move. Clara could hear it, a distant, low restlessness, the particular sound of large animals sensing something coming and not knowing what to do about it. Ethan looked at the sky again. Then he looked at his hands, both of them, the cut on his left still wrapped, the wrapping dirty from the ride. He made a decision she could see forming in his face. "Walt, take Cortez and Reeves to the north pasture. Move them south of the main creek before the storm hits. You've got maybe 40 minutes. He turned toward the barn. "I'll check the south herd and close the upper gate." "What about me?" Clara said. He didn't pause. "Inside. Stay with Mrs. Doyle." "I can—" "Clara." He turned and looked at her, and his voice was not harsh, but it was absolute. "I need to know you're inside. I can't be thinking about where you are and thinking about the cattle at the same time." He held her gaze. "Let me have one problem at a time." She understood, in that moment, that this was not dismissal. It was something else, something she didn't have a clean name for, but recognized in the way you recognize a thing you've been waiting to see. "All right," she said. He nodded once and went. She went back inside with Mrs. Doyle, and they stood at the kitchen window together, and the storm came in like a wall from the north, and the lamp above the table swayed in the draft from the door. Someone had left not quite latched, and Clara watched the darkness out there where the men were, and she kept her hand still in her lap and let herself feel exactly as frightened as she was, because pretending otherwise had never helped her with anything. Mrs. Doyle put more wood in the stove without being asked. The fire took it and built higher. "He'll be fine," Mrs. Doyle said. Not warmly. as a statement of fact based on long experience. I know, Clara said. Outside, the storm settled in over Blackwater Ridge with the complete indifference of something that doesn't know what it's destroying and wouldn't stop if it did. The storm did not behave the way storms were supposed to behave. It did not build gradually and peak and then release. It arrived at full strength and stayed there, hour after hour, pressing down on the ranch like a hand that had decided not to lift. By 9 o'clock, the wind had driven the temperature so far below what it had been at sunset that Clara could feel the difference through the walls. Not a draft exactly, but a change in the quality of the air inside the house, as if the cold were finding ways in that weren't doors or windows, but simply the spaces between things. Mrs. Doyle kept the stove fed. Clara kept the lamp trimmed. They did not talk much, which was not tension but simply the particular silence of two women waiting for men to come back from somewhere dangerous. A silence with long practice behind it on Mrs. Doyle's part, and no practice at all on Clara's, and the difference between them was not visible. Walt came in first, at 9:30. He was coated in ice from the shoulders up. His hat brim had a solid rim of it, his eyebrows were white, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of a man whose hands had stopped feeling precise. Cortez was behind him, and Reeves behind Cortez, and all three of them stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, just breathing the warm air like it was something they needed to remember. "South of the creek?" Clara asked. "Most of them," Walt said. He pulled off his gloves and held his hands over the stove without asking permission. "Lost track of maybe 30 head in the whiteout. They could have gone anywhere." "Ethan?" she said. Walt and Cortez exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, but contained a full conversation. Clara saw it, and her stomach dropped before either of them spoke. "He was coming in behind us," Walt said. "He should have been here by now." The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove and the wind. "How long ago did you last see him?" "See him?" she asked. 20 minutes. Maybe 25. He was at the upper gate, closing it off. Said he'd follow us in." Walt looked at the back door. "Storm's worse than it was. Visibility's nothing out there." Clara stood up from the table. "What direction is the upper gate from here?" "Clara," Mrs. Doyle said. "What direction?" she said again to Walt. "Northeast. Quarter mile, maybe a little more." He looked at her with the expression of a man trying to find the right way to say something. "You can't go out in that. You'd be turned around in 30 seconds. I've done this 20 years and I wouldn't go out in that." "Then tell me something that helps," she said. "Is there a rope line to the upper gate? Any kind of guide?" Walt straightened slightly. "There's a fence line. Runs from the corner post at the east side of the barn northeast toward the upper pasture. If you kept your hand on the fence, you could follow it without getting turned around." He paused. "It's not a short walk in this." "How far does the fence run?" "All the way to the upper gate. It was put in for this kind of weather, years back. Old Halverson's design, actually." Clara was already at the hook by the door where the heavy coats hung. She pulled one down, Ethan's second coat, the heavier one he hadn't taken, and put it on. It was too large. She didn't care. "You're not going alone," Reeves said. He said it quietly, from the corner where he'd been standing, still white with frost, not fully warmed yet. He said it without heroics, as a simple statement of what was going to happen. Walt looked at him, then at Clara, then at the door. "Both of you stay on the fence," he said. "You let go of that fence. You stop where you are, and you call out. Don't move until someone answers." He was already pulling his gloves back on. "I'll come behind you." Mrs. Doyle handed Clara a scarf without speaking. Clara wrapped it, and then she opened the back door and the storm came in like something that had been waiting for exactly that invitation. The cold was a different thing outside than it had been through the walls. It was immediate and total, the kind of cold that doesn't allow for gradual adjustment. It simply replaced the warmth she'd been carrying in her body with the fact of itself, and her lungs registered the change as something close to pain. The wind came from the north and slightly east, which meant it hit her at an angle rather than straight on, which was marginally better, but not enough to matter much. She found the corner post of the east barn fence with her left hand and held on and walked. Reeves was beside her, one hand on the fence also, close enough that she could sense his presence without seeing him. The visibility was exactly what Walt had said it was, which was essentially nothing, just moving white and the suggestion of darkness underneath it. She could feel the fence posts at intervals. She counted them. Not for any navigational reason, but because counting gave her mind something to do that wasn't panic. 1 post, 2, 3. The fence ran true and she kept her hand on it and kept walking. At the 8th post she heard something. She stopped. Reeves stopped beside her. "What?" he said, right at her ear. "Listen," she said. It came again. Not a voice exactly, but a sound that had the irregular quality of something that wasn't wind or snow. Off to the right of the fence line, northeast, further than she could see. "There," she said. She did not let go of the fence. She called out, "Ethan!" The wind took it. She called again, louder, putting everything she had into it. An answer came back, faint, directional, real. To the right and further out. She looked at Reeves. He had heard it too. She could tell from the way he'd gone still. "Stay on the fence," Walt said from behind her. She hadn't heard him catch up, which meant the wind was worse than she'd realized. "He's off to the right," she said. 20 yards, maybe 30? He answered. "You're sure it was him and not—" "I'm sure," she said. Walt came up beside her and she felt him take hold of her arm, not grabbing but anchoring, the way you'd anchor a rope before you let it out. "Call again," he said. She called. The answer came back, and this time it had a word in it. Her name, she thought, though the wind shredded it. And it came from the same direction, which meant he wasn't moving, which was either good because he was staying put or not. Good because he couldn't move. "I'm going off the fence," Walt said. "Hold this." He put something in her free hand, the end of a coiled rope. She felt the other end pull tight as he moved away from her, off the fence, into the white. She held the rope and the fence simultaneously and did not move. Reeves counted seconds under his breath beside her. She heard him get to 40 before the rope went slack in a different way. The slack of someone finding what they were looking for rather than searching. They came back in 3 minutes that were among the longer minutes of Claire's life. Walt first, then Ethan. She knew it was Ethan from the way the rope felt, the weight of a second person, and then she could see the shape of him in the white, and then he was close enough to touch, and she saw why he hadn't come in. His left leg. He'd gone down somewhere in the dark, and the ice, and whatever had happened to his left leg, he couldn't put weight on it. Walt had him upright, but only just. "Upper gate caught in the wind," Ethan said, talking before she could ask, his voice flattened by cold but deliberate. "Swung back on me. Came down wrong." "Can you walk?" she said. "I'm walking," he said, which was technically true in the sense that he was moving toward the house with Walt bearing most of his weight, but was not true in any other sense. The walk back along the fence was longer than the walk out, which is always the way it goes. Clara went first with her hand on the fence and Reeves behind her, and Walt and Ethan behind Reeves, and the wind pushed against them with the indifferent force of something that wasn't trying to stop them but would, as a consequence of its nature, make everything harder. She counted fence posts going back. 14. She felt the corner post of the barn and called out that they were at the barn, and Mrs. Doyle's voice came back from the direction of the house, and she followed the voice. They got him inside. The kitchen became a different kind of room then. The organized, functional urgency of people who need to help someone and know, more or less, what to do. Mrs. Doyle had hot water already, which told Clara she had anticipated this before any of them had said it was needed. Ethan sat in the chair closest to the stove because Walt put him there and he didn't argue, which was itself a measure of how much pain he was in. Because Ethan Callahan did not sit where he was put, unless sitting where he was put was the only remaining option. The leg was not broken. This was Mrs. Doyle's assessment, delivered after she had done what needed doing to determine it, and her assessment carried weight because she had made this call before. It was the knee, twisted, badly, in the fall, and it had swollen in the cold in the way that injuries swell in cold, which is faster and harder than in warmth, and it would not bear his weight for days. Days, Ethan said. Not a question. A problem being assessed. At minimum, Mrs. Doyle said, possibly a week. He looked at the window, where the storm was doing what it had been doing for hours. The south herd needs checking at first light. The feed situation in the lower barn needs to be inventoried against how long this lasts. And I still don't know where those 30 head went. I'll take the south herd at first light, Walt said. Feed inventory, Clara said. Both men looked at her. I know where everything is, she said. I inventoried the outbuildings 2 weeks ago. I know the current count on the lower barn feed, and I know what the daily consumption is per head from the ledger figures. I can calculate how long we can sustain the herd at current feed levels against a weather duration estimate. Ethan looked at Walt. Walt had the expression he always had when Clara said something that moved his internal estimate of her, that reluctant, incremental revision. She's not wrong, Walt said. She knows those numbers better than Cortez does. I'll need the ledger and the current weather reports if there are any, Clara said, and someone to help me physically check the lower barn in the morning, because I can count what I can read. But the barn itself, I'll need a second set of eyes for the things I don't know I'm looking for. Reeves, Walt said. Reeves, who had been quietly eating the food Mrs. Doyle had pushed in front of him, looked up. Yeah, he said, not reluctant, ready. Ethan said nothing for a moment. He was looking at Clara with that expression again, the one she had first seen in the county recorder's office in Helena, the open and uncertain one, the one that didn't have his usual defenses in front of it. She was becoming familiar with it, which was itself a kind of knowledge she hadn't expected to accumulate in 3 weeks. All right, he said, but I want the numbers by 8 in the morning. You'll have them by 7, she said. She got the ledger from the office and sat at the kitchen table while the storm ran itself against the house, and Ethan was helped to the spare room downstairs by Walt. And she worked through the feed calculations with the focused, methodical attention that she brought to every problem that had numbers in it. The calculations were not complicated. They were arithmetic, essentially, consumption rates against current inventory against weather duration, but they required accuracy, and she was accurate. What she found was not catastrophic, but it was not comfortable either. At standard consumption rates, the lower barn feed supply would sustain the full herd for 9 days, but they had 30 head unaccounted for, which meant those animals were somewhere without access to shelter feed and would be consuming more energy just staying warm, and if the storm lasted more than 4 days, the cattle would begin losing condition in ways that had real monetary consequence for spring. She wrote all of this up clearly and set it on the table for morning. Then she sat for a while in the quiet that had settled over the house, the children's story quiet of a storm holding a household inside itself. And she thought about the 30 missing cattle and the 4 days and the way Ethan had said her name in the dark outside when she'd called to him. She thought about that last one briefly and then put it aside because there was still too much practical work ahead to spend time on things that hadn't finished forming yet. The storm broke on the morning of the second day, which was earlier than anyone had expected and later than anyone had wanted. It left behind a cold so clear and bright it was almost aggressive. The sky that particular blue that means the air has been scrubbed empty, and the snow on the ground reflecting the sun with a whiteness that made you squint. The ranch yard looked different after a storm always, Mrs. Doyle said, because it was things moved, things were buried, the geography of a familiar place shifted enough to remind you that you were a visitor to the land rather than the other way around. The south herd was mostly intact. Walt's count, completed by 9 in the morning with Cortez riding the perimeter, put them at 216, better than feared, worse than hoped. The 30 missing head were a problem for the next phase. Reeves and Clara had done the lower barn inventory at first light. She had her numbers on paper before 7 as promised. She brought them to Ethan in the spare room, where he was sitting up in the bed that was 2 inches too short for him with his leg elevated on a pillow and an expression of sustained, controlled frustration that she was beginning to recognize as his version of what other men expressed by throwing things. She set the papers on the blanket beside him. He read them. 9 days at standard rate, he said. Closer to 8, realistically, she said. The storm stress will have elevated consumption. Cold does that. The missing 30. That's the variable, she said. If they're found in the next 2 days and brought in, we're fine. If they're not found within 4 days, they'll be in poor condition and feed consumption will go up further when they come in because they'll need additional rations to recover. Where would they have gone? She asked. If you had to guess. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Storm came from the north-northeast. Animals move away from incoming weather, generally. They'd have drifted south-southwest. He paused. There's a ravine about 2 miles south-southwest of the upper pasture. Natural shelter. If they had their heads about them, they'd have made for it. Is the ravine accessible from the road? Not the main road. There's a track, but it'll be under snow. Can someone get to it on horseback? In this? He considered. Possibly. The snow's not as deep as it looked. The wind packed it in places and left it thin in others. Walt knows the terrain. I'll tell Walt, she said. Clara. She turned at the door. He was looking at her with the directness he used when he was about to say something he'd been not saying for a while. The calculation you did, consumption rates, duration estimates, condition projections. Where did you learn to apply that to livestock? I didn't, she said. I learned it in a dry goods store, applied to inventory and spoilage rates. The arithmetic is the same. You substitute cattle for canned goods and adjust for weather variables. He looked at her for a long moment. That's an unusual way to think about it. It gets the right answer, she said. It does, he said. Something shifted in his face. Not the subtle recalibration she'd seen before, but something more deliberate. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it straight. All right, she said. Before you came here, the agency, they told you I'd sent 2 women back. Yes. Did they tell you anything else about me? About the ranch, the situation, anything beyond what was in the standard arrangement? She understood the question. They told me you were difficult and lonely, and that you were considered one of the most successful landowners in the region, she said. Those were their words. They also told me they thought I was a woman who preferred the truth. And Garrett, he said, did anyone in town tell you anything about Garrett before you started on those files? She looked at him carefully. No, why? He turned the papers in his hands. Because what you found in those files, the letter, the discrepancy, the chain of custody, it saved this ranch's water supply. Not just for now. Permanently, if the correction holds and Garrett's challenge fails. He paused. That's not a small thing. I know, she said. I want you to know that I know, he said. I'm not always good at saying things, but I want you to know I'm aware of what you did. She looked at him in the morning light that was coming through the narrow window of the spare room, this man who was too tall for the bed and too private for easy conversation, and who had lost a son to distance and a wife to the right reasons, and had spent 6 years building a life that he managed by never depending on it to include anyone else. And she felt something that she didn't immediately name because naming it felt premature, like reading the last page of a book before you'd finished the middle. Rest your leg, she said. We'll have the cattle situation handled. She went to find Walt. The ravine, as it turned out, was exactly where Ethan had said it would be. Walt found it that afternoon with Cortez and the 31 head, one more than they'd lost, which Walt noted with the dry humor of a man who has seen cattle do inexplicable things for long enough that he stopped trying to explain them, were in the natural shelter of the ravine's southern wall, cold and uncooperative and alive. Getting them back took until late afternoon, and the effort required all 3 available hands and more profanity than Clara had heard in her combined previous 3 weeks on the ranch. She watched from the fence of the main yard as they drove the cattle in through the gate, and she counted heads as they passed with the methodical attention that she brought to everything. And when the last one was through, she adjusted her feed calculation and carried it back to Ethan with the updated numbers. He read the new figures. We're comfortable, he said. Comfortable enough, she said, if no other variables change. When do variables stop changing on a cattle ranch in Montana winter? He said. I'll let you know when I find out, she said, and something moved across his face that was, unambiguously, a smile. Brief, partial, contained, but real. The kind of smile that only happens when a person has stopped trying to produce one, and it happens anyway. It was the first time she had seen him smile. She looked at it for one moment and then looked at the papers in her hand, because some things are better not examined too directly when they're still new. That evening, the news from town arrived in the form of the mail carrier, who made his rounds regardless of weather on the grounds that weather was not his problem, and who handed over a bundle of correspondence at the front door with the indifference of a man who has delivered enough bad news in good weather and good news in bad weather to have stopped drawing conclusions about what the weather implied. Among the correspondence was a letter from Helena, from Hoskins' office. Clara opened it at the kitchen table with Ethan sitting across from her, his leg propped on a second chair, because he had insisted on coming to the kitchen for dinner, and nobody had argued with him about it because the argument would have been a waste of everyone's time. She read the letter. She read it twice. Garrett's challenge was dismissed, she said. The kitchen was quiet. The correction we filed superseded the erroneous record, she continued. Hoskins' letter confirms the boundary stands as originally surveyed. The creek is yours. She set the letter on the table. He also notes that a formal inquiry has been opened into how the transcription error occurred and remained uncorrected for 11 years. That's not our concern directly, but it may create further complications for anyone who benefited from the error during that period. Ethan read the letter himself. He read it the way he read everything, thoroughly, not performing reaction. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "Garrett's going to know we beat him to it," he said. "Yes," she said. "He's going to know exactly how we beat him to it, too, which means he's going to know it was documentation work rather than legal argument. That's going to bother him more than losing the creek." "Why?" "Because it means someone read your files better than he did," she said. "And he'll know who that someone was." Ethan looked at her. "You think he'll come at you directly?" "I think he'll look for a way to make this personal," she said. "Men like Garrett don't accept that they lost to a piece of paper. They need to have lost to a person, because a person can be dealt with in ways that a public record can't." The lamp above the table swayed slightly in a draft. The back door not quite latched again, the same problem it had been since she arrived. She made a note to mention it to Walt. "He won't touch you," Ethan said. Not a reassurance, a statement of intention. "I can handle myself," she said. "I know you can," he said. "That doesn't change what I said." She looked at him across the kitchen table, the lamp between them, the papers between them, the half-eaten dinner between them, and the 3 weeks of daily accumulation that sat behind all of it, like a foundation that had been laid one small piece at a time without anyone declaring they were building something. Walt came in from outside, stomping snow off his boots, and the moment reorganized itself into the ordinary evening business of the ranch. And Clara collected the dishes, and Mrs. Doyle took over the kitchen, and Ethan went back to the spare room with the careful, one-legged dignity of a man who was not going to ask for help walking if he could avoid it. She was at the kitchen table an hour later. The feed projection updated, the correspondence sorted, the week's supply list drafted, when Mrs. Doyle came in from washing up and stood in the doorway looking at Clara with an expression that was not quite the face she used for practical matters. 12 days, Mrs. Doyle said. Clara looked up. "Garrett's number," Mrs. Doyle said. "When you were supposed to be gone by." She looked at the papers on the table, the lamp, the organized stacks. "I had a number too. I didn't say it out loud, but I had one." "What was your number?" Clara asked. Mrs. Doyle considered. "I didn't have a when," she said. "I had a whether." She turned to go back through the door, then stopped. "I've made my decision on it," she said, without looking back, and went to bed. Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she turned back to her papers. Outside, the last of the storm's cold was settling into the ground, that deep winter cold that means it's done moving and has arrived to stay. The ranch was quiet, in the way it was always quiet at night, full of sounds that weren't silence but amounted to it, the sounds of a working place at rest. Horses. Wind in the eaves, the stove settling. She thought about what Ethan had said in the spare room. "I want you to know that I know." She thought about the way Walt had looked at her when the cattle came through the gate, and the way Reeves had simply said, "yeah," when Walt had assigned him to her at the barn. Not reluctant, but ready, as if it had become a natural thing for someone to say. She thought about what she'd told Ethan on the road to Helena, that she'd come here to find out what kind of life she could build if the space was bigger. She was finding out. It was not graceful, and it was not what she'd pictured, and it was harder in every physical dimension than anything she'd done in Ohio, and there were things about it that frightened her in the quiet moments when she let herself feel them. But it was hers. She could feel that clearly, the way you feel the difference between carrying something that belongs to you and carrying something that belongs to someone else. She finished the supply list. She turned out the lamp. She went to her room. Her room, the one she had been shown on the first night and had made incrementally her own in the weeks since, the extra blanket on the chair, the small stack of books on the windowsill, the duplicate land record log she kept in the drawer, and she lay in the dark and listened to the ranch around her. Somewhere in the house, Ethan Callahan was awake. She was fairly certain of it. She didn't know how she was certain, but she was. She thought about the smile, the partial, brief, unintended one. Then she closed her eyes and let the day go, and the ranch held itself quietly in the winter dark, and nothing broke, and nobody left, and that was enough. Garrett made his move in February. Not through the county recorder's office. That door had been closed to him with the finality of a public record. And Garrett was many things, but he was not a man who kept throwing himself at a wall that had been bricked up in front of him. He moved instead through the mechanism that men like him had always used when documentation failed them: reputation. Specifically, Clara's. It started small, the way these things always start. Small enough that she didn't hear about it until it had already been running for 2 weeks. A remark at the feed store. A suggestion at the saloon. The particular kind of story that doesn't make a direct accusation because direct accusations can be refuted. It simply plants a question and lets the question do the work. The question, in this case, was about where Clara Whitmore had actually come from, and whether the mail order arrangement was the whole of the story, and whether a woman who arrived alone in a frontier town with nothing but a suitcase and an unusual facility with other people's paperwork might have reasons for that facility that weren't entirely respectable. She found out the way she found out most things that happened in Blackwater Ridge, from Mrs. Doyle, who found out from the woman who ran the dress shop, who had told Mrs. Doyle with the specific urgency of someone passing information they believe the recipient needs to have, even if they're not sure it's their place to pass it. Mrs. Doyle told Clara on a Thursday morning in the kitchen, plainly and without decoration, because that was how Mrs. Doyle handled things she considered important. Clara listened without interrupting. When Mrs. Doyle finished, Clara sat with it for a moment and felt the particular quality of anger that comes not from surprise. She had told Ethan in the kitchen weeks ago that Garrett would make it personal, but from the specific indignity of having your character questioned by someone who has never spent 5 minutes trying to understand it. What exactly is he saying, she asked. That you may have left Ohio under circumstances that weren't discussed with the agency, Mrs. Doyle said. That there may be a reason you were willing to come to a man that 3 other women had already left. Clara looked at the table. He's implying I had no other choice, that I was running from something. Yes. She looked up. Was that Mrs. Alcott at the dress shop? Yes. Is she someone who repeats things or someone who holds them? Mrs. Doyle considered. Holds them, mostly. She told me because she thought I should know, not because she wanted it further along. All right. Clara stood and pushed her chair in. Is Ethan in the office? He was, going over the spring cattle projections with Walt, who had been coming to the office more since Ethan's knee had kept him from the yard for the first 10 days after the storm. The knee was better now. Not right, but functional, which for Ethan meant he was treating it as right, and Walt was quietly managing the gap between those two things. She knocked and came in and looked at Ethan and said, I need a few minutes. Walt read the room with the accuracy he applied to everything and said he needed to check on something and left, closing the door behind him, and Clara sat in the chair across from Ethan's desk and told him what Mrs. Doyle had told her. He listened the way he listened, completely, without interrupting. When she finished, the quality of his stillness was different from his usual stillness. It had heat in it. I'll go see Garrett, he said. No, she said. He looked at her. If you go see Garrett, it confirms that the story has power, she said. It tells the town that you felt the need to defend it, which tells them there's something to defend against. She kept her voice even, because the anger was real, and she couldn't afford to let it be the thing that drove the decision. The answer to a story isn't a confrontation, it's a better story. And what's the better story? He said. The true one, she said. My father's name is Robert Whitmore. He ran a dry goods store in Mill Haven, Ohio, for 30 years. He is alive and in good health, and his business reputation in Mill Haven is without question. I left with his blessing and his correspondence address, and if anyone in this town wants to write to him and ask whether his daughter left Ohio under circumstances that warranted concern, they are welcome to do so, and he will write back and tell them exactly what those circumstances were. She paused. I need to write to him today, not to ask him to defend me, to let him know this is happening, so he's not caught without warning if a letter arrives. Ethan was looking at her with that open expression, the one that wasn't guarded, the one that came when he'd run out of the usual reasons to keep the distance in his face. You've already thought through how to handle this, he said. I've been thinking about it since Helena, she said. I told you he would make it personal. You did tell me that. I need something else from you, she said. What? She held his gaze. I need to know if any of what he's implying changes what you think of me. Because if it does, I'd rather know now than later, and I won't think worse of you for it. You don't know me well enough yet to be certain about much, and I understand that." The office was quiet. Outside, she could hear Walt doing whatever Walt did when he was giving people time. Probably something genuinely useful, because Walt was not a man who performed busyness. "I read your father's letter," Ethan said. She blinked. "What?" "The agency sent a reference package with your placement file. There was a letter from your father in it. I read it before I agreed to the arrangement." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "He wrote about you the way a man writes about something he's proud of and is trying not to oversell because he knows overselling it will make it less believable. He said you were the most capable person he'd known in 30 years of business, that you had more patience for difficult problems than anyone he'd worked with, and that whoever was lucky enough to have your attention would probably spend the first month not knowing what they had." He paused. "He also said you sometimes forgot to eat when you were working." Clara did not say anything for a moment. She had not known about the letter. Her father had not mentioned it. "So no," Ethan said. "What Garrett is implying doesn't change what I think of you. It tells me what Garrett is willing to do when he's losing, which I already knew." She looked at her hands for a moment because his face was doing something she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. Then she looked back up. "Thank you," she said. "Write to your father," he said. "I'll handle the other part." "You said you wouldn't go to Garrett." "I'm not going to Garrett," he said. "I'm going to talk to people." "That's different." She let him have that. He understood the terrain of Blackwater Ridge in ways she was still learning, and she had enough sense to know that the limits of her knowledge were real limits, not modesty. She wrote to her father that afternoon. Not a letter asking for help, a letter explaining the situation, giving him the facts without drama, and telling him to expect correspondence from Montana if it came. She wrote to him the way she always wrote to him, which was directly, with the implicit acknowledgement that he was a person who could handle being told the truth without needing it softened. She signed it with the same signature she had used her whole life, Clara E. Whitmore, the middle initial standing for Eleanor, her mother's name, which she had carried for so long that she barely noticed it anymore. She folded the letter and addressed it and put it with the outgoing correspondence. Then she went back to work, because work was the thing she knew how to do when everything else was uncertain, and the spring supply projections didn't care about Doyle Garrett's opinions. What Ethan did in the following week, she was not entirely sure, because he did it in the way that men do things in small towns, through conversations she wasn't present for, through the weight of his presence in places where his presence carried meaning. What she knew was the result. Within 10 days, the story Garrett had been circulating had run into a wall of contrary information, so thoroughly sourced and plainly stated that it didn't so much collapse as simply stop moving. She heard this from Mrs. Doyle again, and from Reeves, who reported it with the satisfied brevity of someone who had been hoping for exactly this outcome. What she heard specifically was that Ethan Callahan had gone to the feed store and the land office and the place where ranchers gathered on Friday afternoons, and had told anyone who would listen that Clara Whitmore had, in her first 3 weeks at the ranch, corrected a land record error that had been sitting in his files for 11 years, organized his equipment manifest and supply ledger, traveled 2 days to the county recorder's office in weather that had kept sensible people indoors, and managed the storm feed crisis with arithmetic that had kept his herd whole. He had said these things without apparent emotion, in the flat declarative manner he used for facts, and the facts had done what facts do when they're specific and verifiable, and stated by someone whose word carries weight. Garrett's story had nothing specific and verifiable in it. It was suggestion and implication cannot survive sustained contact with specific, documented fact. Mrs. Alcott at the dress shop sent a note to the ranch, addressed to Clara. It said, "I owe you an apology for hearing things I should not have repeated. You are welcome in my shop any time." It was brief and slightly stiff, the note of a woman who is not accustomed to apologizing but has decided it's necessary. Clara wrote back and thanked her and said she hoped to visit the shop in spring, and meant it. The letter from Halverson in Portland arrived in March. It was longer than she had expected, 4 pages, in the careful handwriting of a man who had grown old enough to take correspondence seriously. He wrote about the original survey, about where he had understood the boundary to stand when he sold to Callahan, about the conversation he'd had with the surveyor in the summer of 1879, and what had been said about the creek specifically. He wrote from memory, and he was clear about what he was certain of and what he was reconstructing, which made it more credible rather than less. At the end, he wrote, "I should have stayed in touch with Callahan better than I did. A man doesn't always know which loose end is going to matter until it pulls." She brought the letter to Ethan. He read it and sat with it for a while. "This would have settled the county dispute conclusively," he said, "even without the correction we filed." "Yes," she said, "but we didn't have it then. We had what we had and we used it and it worked." "Keep it in the file," he said. "If Garrett tries another angle, it's there." She filed it. She noted it in the land record log. She updated the chain of custody documentation. It took 20 minutes, and she did it with the same attention she brought to everything, and when it was done, the file was as complete as a file could be, with no gaps she was aware of, and no letters behind any receipts. Spring came to Blackwater Ridge the way spring comes to frontier country. Not with flowers, but with mud. The ground went from frozen to soft to treacherous in the space of 2 weeks, and the work of the ranch shifted from the defensive work of winter to the expansive, exhausting work of a place waking up and demanding things from the people who ran it. Calving began in the second week of March. The upper pasture fence, damaged by the winter storm, needed repair before the herd could be moved north again. The creek, Callahan's Creek, documented and filed and unambiguous, ran higher than usual with snowmelt, and the low crossing near the south barn flooded for 9 days and required a temporary solution involving sandbags and a great deal of creative profanity from Walt. Clara worked through all of it. She had learned, by March, how to read the calving signs well enough to alert the hands when something needed attention, though she was careful about the limits of that knowledge and said so. She had learned which equipment needed daily checking in the mud season and which could be left. She had learned that Reeves was reliable for any task that required sustained attention and less reliable for tasks that required initiative, and that Cortez was the opposite, and she had started assigning work accordingly without making it into a system or saying anything about it, just doing it, the way you manage things that are working without announcing that you're managing them. She had also learned things about Ethan that you could only learn from proximity and time. She had learned that he woke at 4, regardless of what had happened the previous day, that he read for 30 minutes after dinner in a chair by the stove, that was specifically his in the way that certain objects become specifically one person's through accumulated use. She had learned that he was better at receiving difficult news than delivering it, that he was most himself when he was doing physical work, and least himself when he was required to be social in town. She had learned that he had written to his son, had found that out from Mrs. Doyle, who knew because she managed the household correspondence, a letter at Christmas and another in February, and that he had received back, in March, a drawing of a horse, done in the uncoordinated lines of a 9-year-old, with the word Papa written underneath it in someone else's handwriting because the boy was learning but couldn't quite manage it alone yet. She had found that drawing on the kitchen table one morning, left there, she thought accidentally, though she was not certain, when Ethan had gone out early. She had looked at it for a moment, the horse with its uneven legs and the careful letters of a word the boy had needed help writing, and she had felt something very specific and human and hard to name, the feeling of understanding something about a person's pain that they haven't told you directly, but that is legible in a single piece of paper. She put it on the desk in the office where it would be easy to find and did not mention it. In April, the question that had been between them since the fire at Ridley Creek Camp finally became a conversation. Not dramatically. There was no dramatic version of how this happened, because neither of them were people who built toward dramatic moments. It happened on an ordinary evening, after a day of ordinary work, when the mud was finally beginning to dry, and the upper pasture fence was repaired and the calving count was better than projected. They were sitting in the kitchen after dinner, Ethan with his ledger and Clara with the spring supply orders, and Mrs. Doyle had gone to bed early because she had woken early, and the kitchen was theirs in the specific way that a room becomes yours when no one else is in it, and you are both comfortable enough to not need to perform anything. "I want to talk to you about the arrangement," Ethan said. She set her pen down. "All right." "We've been in it for 3 months," he said, "which is longer than either previous arrangement lasted, by a significant margin." He looked at the ledger and then at her. "I want to know what you want." "What I want," she said. "From this. From here. I'm not asking because I want you to leave, so I want to say that clearly before I say anything else. I'm asking because I've been here 3 months, and I know what I want, and I think it's a conversation we should have rather than something I should assume. Clara looked at him. He was looking back at her with the directness that was characteristic of him, the kind that didn't hedge or approach sideways. The kind she had understood from their first conversation in the land office was how he said the things that mattered. "What do you want?" she said. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as an arrangement, not because the agency filed papers and the terms are what they are. I want you to stay because I want you here, and I think you should know that, and I want to know if it's what you want too." He paused. "I'm not good at this. I know I'm not good at this. But I've learned in the last few years that not being good at something and not doing it anyway are different problems, and I'm trying to do the one I can." She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because the thing he'd just said deserved to land fully before she answered it. "I told you in November," she said, "on the road to Helena. I told you I wasn't going anywhere." "I know," he said. "I remember. I want to hear it again." She looked at him across the kitchen table. The lamp between them, the same table that had held land records and manifests and supply orders, and the feed calculations from the night of the storm. All the accumulated paper of a life being built. "I'm staying," she said. "I want to be here. Not because I have nowhere else to go, and not because the arrangement says so. Because this is mine now. The work is mine, the place is mine, and—" She paused, because the next part was harder, and she was also not naturally good at this. "And you're someone I want to know better, which I realize I've been knowing better for 3 months whether or not we were talking about it." Ethan Callahan did not say anything for a moment. He nodded once, slowly, which she understood was not dismissal, but the way he received things that mattered, quietly, completely, without the performance of feeling that some people mistake for the feeling itself. "There's something I should have told you," he said. She waited. "The agency's arrangement has a formal period," he said. 6 months before a legal marriage can be registered. We're at 3. That means in 3 months there's a legal question on the table." He looked at his hands. "I'm not asking you to answer it tonight. I'm telling you it exists so you can think about it on your own terms, not because a deadline arrived." "I know about the 6-month period," she said. "The agency explained it." "All right." "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "I already know my answer, but I'm glad you gave me the 3 months to think about it in, because that was the right way to do it." She picked up her pen. "Now, let me finish the supply orders, or we'll be short on wire by the time the summer fence work starts." He looked at her for a moment with something that was more than the brief partial smile she'd seen after the cattle came in from the ravine. It was fuller than that, less guarded, the expression of a man who has stopped waiting for something to go wrong and has not yet gotten used to that. He went back to his ledger. She went back to the supply orders. The lamp burned between them, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the spring night was cold but not dangerously cold, just the ordinary cold of a place that doesn't warm all the way until June, and that was fine. Doyle Garrett came to the ranch one more time, in May. He came alone, which was different, and he came without the grin, which was the most different thing of all. He rode in on a Tuesday afternoon when Ethan was in the north pasture and Clara was in the yard checking the water pump, which had been making a sound it shouldn't. She straightened when she heard the horse and watched him come through the gate, and she waited. He dismounted and stood with his reins in his hand and looked at her. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him, which had only been months ago, but something in his face had changed in the way faces change, when a person has had to reckon with something they spent a long time not reckoning with. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Garrett," she said. "Callahan around?" "North pasture, back before dinner." He nodded. He looked at the yard, the repaired fence, the organized equipment, the general quality of a place that was being run well. She watched him look at it. "I came to say something," he said. "I'll say it to Callahan when he's here, but I'll say it to you first because you're the one who's owed it." He met her eyes briefly and then looked at the ground, the way people look when they're saying something that requires more humility than they're comfortable with. "What I had people saying in town, in January, about you, that was wrong. It was wrong when I did it, and I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway because I was angry about the boundary, and I took it in a direction it didn't have any business going." He cleared his throat. "I'm telling you I was wrong. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I just want it said." Clara looked at him for a long moment. He was not a man she would ever trust, and she was not naive enough to think this apology changed the fundamental calculation of who Doyle Garrett was or what he was capable of. But she was also not a person who believed that refusing to receive an honest accounting served any useful purpose. "I hear you," she said. "I appreciate you saying it." He nodded once. "The boundary," he said. "I've had legal counsel review the corrected record. They tell me it's solid." "It is," she said. "I'm not going to pursue it further." "That's a wise decision," she said. He looked at her then with an expression she didn't expect, something between respect and the specific discomfort of a person who has been outmaneuvered so thoroughly that the only honest response is to acknowledge it. "You found that letter in his files," he said. "The transcription error." "Yes. I've been sitting on that error for 3 years," he said, waiting for the right time to move on it. "I had a lawyer, I had a surveyor, I had the county contacts to make it stick." He paused. "You were here 3 weeks." "6 days," she said. "When I found it." He made a sound that was not a laugh. "6 days," he said. He put his hat on. "I'll wait for Callahan by the gate." She went back to the water pump and let him wait. When Ethan came in and she saw from the yard the conversation that happened by the gate. Brief, standing, no hands shaken, but no raised voices either. She did not try to read it at that distance. She learned what was said later, from Ethan, in the kitchen, when he reported it with the concise accuracy of a man who is not interested in embellishment. Garrett had said his piece about the boundary. He had said something else, too, which Ethan repeated without preamble. "He said you were the most dangerous person who'd ever come to Blackwater Ridge," Ethan said. "He meant it as a complaint. I took it as a compliment." "Dangerous," she said. "His word." Ethan poured coffee and sat down. "He means you read things he couldn't afford to have read, that you found the one piece of paper in 11 years that changed everything. In the world Garrett operates in, that's the most dangerous thing a person can do." Clara thought about that, about the letter behind the receipts, the one that had been misfiled for 11 years, the coordinate notation that was 200 yards east of where it should have been. She thought about the tin box under her bed in Mill Haven, where she had kept the letter from the Kansas City rancher — she doesn't have the physical constitution — and the Ohio life she had known exactly the shape of, and the agency letter that had called her a woman who preferred the truth. She thought about what it meant to be dangerous in the way Garrett meant it, which was simply this, that she had paid attention to something, and paying attention had mattered. "There are worse things to be," she said. Ethan looked at her across the table. "There are," he said. The formal registration happened in June, on a Tuesday, in the Blackwater Ridge County office that served for civil proceedings. It was not an elaborate event. There were no decorations and no large gathering, because neither of them had wanted those things, and they had discussed it plainly and agreed. Walt was there. Reeves was there. Mrs. Doyle was there, in a different dress than her usual one, which was as close as Mrs. Doyle came to ceremony. A woman from town named Mrs. Fetter, who had been the first person in Blackwater Ridge to greet Clara with uncomplicated warmth when they had passed in the street in March, stood near the door and smiled. The county official read the necessary language. Ethan said what needed to be said. Clara said what needed to be said. It took 11 minutes, which seemed both very short and exactly the right amount of time for a thing that had been 3 months and a long Ohio life in the making. Afterward, outside on the wooden sidewalk, Reeves said something to Walt that made Walt give him a look. And then Walt smiled, which was the smile Clara had been watching inch toward existence for 6 months, wide and genuine, and arrived at last. Mrs. Doyle straightened her hat. Mrs. Fetter said she had made something for the ranch kitchen and would bring it by, and did. Ethan stood beside Clara on the sidewalk while the others drifted toward their horses. The main street of Blackwater Ridge went about its Tuesday business around them. Some of the same people who had been there the day she arrived, the day the sign landed in the mud, the day Doyle Garrett stood with his grin and his 12-day estimate, were on this street today. She did not look for them specifically. She looked at the street itself, the general Tuesday fact of it, the stores and the horses and the dog asleep in the dust outside the saloon that might have been the same dog from that first day for all she could tell. "What are you thinking?" Ethan said. "That 12 days was a very bad estimate," she said. He looked at her, and the smile came. The full version, the one she had been collecting the rare appearances of since January, and it did what she had noticed from the first time it happened, which was that it changed his face entirely, made it younger and less defended, and more like the face of the person she had been slowly learning was underneath the reserve. "He's going to hear that you said that," he said. "I know," she said. "Let him." They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light, which was the long gold light of a Montana June, the kind of light that makes the land look like something imagined rather than real. Though it was real, completely and entirely real, the hills to the north, and the grass on the valley floor, and the road home that Clara now knew well enough to ride without watching it. There is a thing that happens when you build a life in unfamiliar territory. When you come to a place that doesn't know you and set about becoming known to it. It does not happen quickly, and it does not happen by announcement, and it does not happen because someone declares that you belong. It happens the way the land record correction happened. One document at a time, one thing verified, one gap filled, one morning at 4 o'clock, and then another, until the accumulated weight of all those ordinary mornings becomes something you can stand on. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Blackwater Ridge with an old suitcase and the specific, practical hope of a woman who had decided that a life she had to work for was worth more than a life that fit the space she was given. She had been mocked and measured and assigned 12 days. She had been the subject of a story that was meant to diminish her and had failed because the truth was more specific and better sourced. What she had built in that time was not a triumph in the way that word usually gets used. It was not dramatic, and it was not sudden. It was a manifest corrected and a boundary preserved, and 31 cattle found in a ravine, and a letter written to a man in Portland, and a wounded knee getting a person back inside in the dark. It was the particular, unglamorous work of making herself indispensable to a place and a life and a person until indispensable became, gradually and without ceremony, beloved. That is the kind of victory that doesn't get celebrated loudly, because the people who achieve it are too busy with the next problem to stop. But it is the only kind that lasts. The loud victories fade. The ones built from daily, documented, unheroic attention, those hold. She knew that. She had always known that, somewhere in the practical, precise part of herself that her father had recognized when he wrote to a stranger in Montana about his daughter. She had simply needed a space big enough to prove it. Montana had turned out to be exactly big enough. The ranch came into view ahead of them as the road curved north. The barn first, then the main house, then the outbuildings she had walked through on her third morning here, while Mrs. Doyle explained each one with compressed efficiency. She knew all of them now, their contents and their schedules and their particular demands in different seasons. She knew the north pasture fence line and the water pump's mechanical sound and the way Walt's silence meant one thing and Reeves's silence meant another. She knew which drawer the duplicate land record log lived in and where the letters from Portland were filed and which chair by the stove was specifically Ethan's and not to sit in it unless invited, which she had been, twice, and had found she preferred her own chair anyway because it faced the window. Ethan rode beside her on the last stretch of road. He didn't say anything and she didn't say anything because there was nothing left to say that the day hadn't already said. And they were both people who understood the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was full. The yard was as she'd left it. The water pump had been looked at by Reeves in her absence, and he'd left a note on the kitchen table. Sound is the left coupling. Walt says it can wait until Saturday, which told her the problem was minor and also that the ranch kept moving when she wasn't watching, which was as it should be. Mrs. Doyle had dinner on the stove. The evening went the way evenings went. The hands came in, the food was eaten, the day was talked through in the abbreviated shorthand of people who have worked together long enough to communicate in partial sentences. After dinner, Walt and Cortez and Reeves went back to the bunkhouse, and Mrs. Doyle went to her room, and Ethan sat in his chair with his ledger, and Clara sat in her chair with the summer supply orders she had not finished in the morning, and the lamp burned between them. She worked for a while. He worked for a while. The stove settled. "The letter from Portland," he said, without looking up from the ledger. "Halverson's?" she said. "The one from his son," he said, "in February. The drawing." She was quiet. "I know you saw it," he said. "On the table." "I put it on the desk in the office," she said, "where it would be safe." "I know," he said. He was still looking at the ledger, though she had the impression he was not reading it. "I'm going to write to him again, ask if he'd come visit. Not this summer. It would be too soon, and it's a long way. But next summer, maybe, if his mother would allow it." He paused. I thought you should know, since it would be your house, too. It already is my house, she said. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at the supply order in her hand, wire and nails and feed projections, and the ordinary arithmetic of a life in the West. She thought about a 9-year-old in St. Louis who had needed someone else's handwriting to write Papa under a drawing of a horse. She thought about what it would mean to make room in a house for that, the complication of it, the imperfection of it, the fact that nothing about it would be simple or clean or resolved by a single document. She thought about how she had never wanted anything simple or clean, had never believed that simple and clean were what a real life was made of. Write to him, she said. Tell him about the ranch. Tell him about the cattle and the pasture and the creek. She looked at Ethan. Tell him about the water pump. He looked back at her. The water pump. Children like specific details, she said. They want to know what things actually are, not a large ranch. They want to know about the pump and the horse names and how far the hills are. It makes the place real. He was quiet for a moment. You know a lot about children for someone who doesn't have any. I was one, she said, and I have a good memory. He looked at her with something that was gratitude and something that was more than gratitude. The face of a man who has been carrying a weight for long enough that he can no longer always feel its edges, and has just had someone help him set it down enough to remember what his arms feel like without it. All right, he said, the water pump. She went back to the supply order. He went back to the ledger. The lamp burned and the ranch held itself around them in the June dark. And somewhere to the north, the creek ran high with the last of the snowmelt, moving across land that was documented and filed and settled, moving across ground that had been argued over and then wasn't, because a woman had read every paper in a filing cabinet in her first week and had paid attention to a letter behind a folder of receipts. The things we overlook have a way of mattering more than we expected. The people we dismiss have a way of becoming the ones we cannot imagine doing without. And the life that nobody thought would hold, built by daily work and documented evidence and a kind of stubborn, unglamorous attention to what is actually true, turns out to be the strongest kind of life there is. Clara Whitmore had known that when she left Ohio. She had simply needed somewhere big enough and difficult enough to prove it. She finished the supply order. She set it with the outgoing correspondence. She banked the stove and said goodnight and went to her room. And the house settled in around that goodnight like it had settled around every goodnight before it, fully, easily, the way a house settles around people who belong in it. Outside, Blackwater Ridge was quiet. In the way it was always quiet at night, the vast, indifferent dark of the frontier pressing gently against the light that the house put out. Not hostile, just large, just itself. And the light held.